We're going to get started, if you don't mind. Let me thank you all for braving the elements today and making it to this talk. I think the title of Pascal's talk should have been Why University Administrators Do Not Understand the Weather. So it's my great pleasure to welcome my friend Pascal Boyer to our Colloquium series. Pascal is the Henry Luce Professor of Individual and Collective Memory at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, where the weather is better today than it is here, I hear. Pascal is a cognitive anthropologist, and he has a dual appointment in the departments of psychology and anthropology at his home institution. He has a PhD in ethnology from Paris-Nanterre in France. He spent some time at this place that nobody's heard about in the UK called Cambridge, teaching. He was a visiting professor at University of California, Santa Barbara, and at the University of Lyon, where I happened to spend a lovely sabbatical about a decade ago. He's an extraordinarily accomplished scholar. He's published or edited 6 books. He was a Guggenheim Fellow. Very jealous of that. I've tried a few times, but maybe you can give me tips on how to get in. He's published in leading scientific journals, Nature, BBS, TICS, and so on and so forth. And he's also received numerous grants. I think the thing, I met Pascal about 10 years ago here, in fact, after I had read his amazing book, Religion Explained. I became a fan right away, and then we met, and he's also a lovely guy, so we became friends. And I think what impresses me most about Pascal is that he is somewhat of a Renaissance man, meaning that he has a very broad range of interests and touches on some very interesting and deep questions. I want to give you a sense of the kinds of questions that he asks. So one thread in his research is evolution, cognition, and culture, where Pascal asks how our evolved psychology can explain human cultures. And he does research on this, publishes papers, he just doesn't dabble in it. He's also interested in coalitional psychology, the dispositions that allow humans to form stable, highly cohesive groups. Folk economic beliefs, so we go in another direction here, very interesting, is probably might talk about this a bit today. How human minds perceive market processes and market forces, very relevant today. Threat detection, what threats humans perceive and what explains ritualized. You should do a study in academic departments to see what threats people perceive. I think it'd be very, very interesting. And of course, religious thought and behavior. So why do we have religious representations as human beings, and why the particular beliefs that we have? But perhaps Pascal is best known for his groundbreaking 2001 book, Religion Explained, which was really an amazing book, and he has fans here in the room, former students of mine who I think are eager to have him sign the book. Just to get, if you haven't read it and don't have heard of the cognitive science religion, but don't really know what it is, it's not fluffy. It's very interesting and serious. Just want to show you, this is Steven Pinker on the book. Pinker wrote that it's the most important treatment of the psychological basis of religious belief since William James. As you know, William James famously wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience. John Tooby and Lida Cosmides wrote about Religion Explained that it is the first classic of 21st century anthropology, and the Washington Post described it as a penetrating scientific analysis of religion. Pascal's latest book, which came out this past year, is called Minds Make Societies, and it made for a lovely, I was going to say read, but listen on my way from Philadelphia to Rutgers. I listened to a lot of books. It was lovely to listen to this book. Just to give you a sense of what it is about, here's a description from the blurb. A watershed book that masterfully integrates insights from evolutionary biology, genetics, psychology, economics, and more to explore the development and workings of human societies. And today Pascal is going to talk to us about some of the ideas that he developed in the book in a presentation entitled not Why Administrators Don't Understand Weather Patterns, but Why Humans Do Not Understand Human Societies, Evolved Intuitive Sociology, and the Social Sciences. So please help me welcome Pascal Boyer.
thank you, Julia. That's a very tough introduction to follow. I think you set me up for massive disappointment. All right, so thank you very much. Thanks to Rox for inviting me, and thanks to Julien for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to be back here and see some familiar faces and new faces. So, all right, I will talk about something. This is it's not. It's for a good cause because they're trying to make life better for us. So it's good. I won't complain. So why humans do not understand societies, and what I mean by that is some sort of paradox that it's quite clear that we're designed to live in societies and to build societies. But often we have understandings of how they work that are really strikingly inaccurate or incoherent. And I'll give you lots of examples of these things. And I have a solution, of course, which is that we have all sorts of, we do not have a very good understanding, especially of large societies, but we have evolved intuitions that support what I call a folk-sociology, which is kind of misleading, but is also a very useful set of tools to understand how society works. So, and there's an added twist at the end, if I have time, which is to say, well, after all, since we have this folk sociology, is politics possible? And I know everyone will tell me, no, it's not only possible, it's totally real, and I'm saturated with it. No, that's not what I mean. I mean politics that actually captures some of the actual dynamics of complex societies. So, we have all sorts of capacities and preferences that make it possible to build coalitions, to build families, to have gender relations, to have trade, to have exchange, to have collective action, cooperation, group defense, and all sorts of other things. And it's still kind of interesting that the kind of social arrangements that are built out of all these things are a bit opaque to many of us. So it would take a whole book to explain all this, of course. And as it turns out, okay, I will be a bit lighter on the advertising because Julien did it very well. So, and the theme of the book is that we have evolved specialized systems that explain all sorts of aspects of social and cultural arrangements, like why people have religions, why you have recurrent features in family and gender arrangements, why you have particular forms of group conflict, ethnicity, and all that pop up in many different cultures, how cooperation works, how people believe in strange stuff, that's what I call junk culture, and I will talk a little bit about that at the end, etc. But today I want to talk about this really interesting problem, which is that very often we do not have a very coherent or explanatory understanding of the social orders in which we live. So how does that work? Well, we do have mental representations of social things. We have representations, what I call a folk sociology, that is representations that are explicit, that describe social processes. They're generally socially transmitted. And here I will focus on three kinds of such concepts. The concepts of social groups, like, when you say, well, if we do this, Asian Americans will be happy, but Latinos will be really disgruntled. So, that's the sort of concept of social groups we have, which is very, very clear for us. We have concepts of norms and rules, like it's a convention here that you drive on the right side of the road. We know that that's the rule, that's the norm. We have various words for that, but we have some sort of explicit conception of what it is. And concepts of authority and power, like, the president has a certain amount of power, the Congress has some power, the police forces have power, and so on and so forth. We have explicit notions of what that is. And what I want to say is that this folk sociology, which is not super coherent sometimes, is actually supported by all sorts of much more specialized social intuitions. That is, descriptions of social interactions that are very intuitive, they're implicit, they're activated by specific cues. And if you, what I'm trying to describe here is the interaction between those intuitions that we have that are the outcome of evolved system for social interaction, and the folk sociology, the explicit, generally sort of meta-represented versions of our social processes. So if this seems obscure, it's because it is obscure, because I haven't given you the examples yet. So we'll talk about that. I will talk about three kinds of folk sociological notions: the explicit notions of groups, the explicit concepts of power, and explicit notions of norms and social norms. So let's start with agents. It's a very common thing. All the things I will say now are incredibly banal, and that's the point. They're the sort of vocabulary we have, or conceptual repertoire we have to talk about society, and it seems completely obvious to us that institutions, organizations, and things like that are agents. Like, when you say these things, like IBM has a habit of doing this, Japan will not accept that, the committee was reluctant to. If you're used to academic committees, you know that that's something that happens quite a lot, that, all the irrationality of collective decision-making is explained in agent terms, like, the committee felt that. Then you realize that no one felt that, but the committee felt that. But also groups are made of generic agents, and that's something that there's a very powerful way in which, especially in mass societies, in large societies, we use terms like the workers are fed up with this, or I will talk a little bit more about this, there's more segregation here than there because people are more racist here than there, that sort of thing. Germans are hardworking, that's an example of a stereotype. So where you have a generic representation of a whole collection of people. And that's not just in large societies. These are examples from sort of more small-scale societies and kind of exotic contexts for us, like this description of a village in western Tibet in Nepal, where people have a very clear idea once they have those village meetings. It's an interesting case because it's a village where they change their laws every 12 years. So they get together and talk about these things, and then have this sort of a clear impression that the village has decided to do this or that. Or, look at this idiom from Madagascar, that's from an ethnography by Maurice Bloch, where people think that the lineage is an agent. The lineage wants to, that's the clan, it wants to do certain things against other lineages, and the people are just temporary residents of that entity, which is like the real agent. The lineage is angry, for example. Another example that I will say a bit more about that is from Berber villages, from a description by Ernest Genner, where people say the village has realized that this man is a saint. This is a situation where some people happen to be saints. You mustn't sort of think anything too extraordinary. They're just people who have more grace than others and are therefore used to negotiate problems in villages and sort of generally guide people. So they have more grace, baraka, and they occasionally do a few miracles, but that's very, very low-key. So the thing is that, as any social scientist will tell you in Social Sciences 101 or whatever, social groups are not really like agents at all, and there are so many properties of social groups that do not work in terms of agents. Collectives, for example, do not have a coherent belief desire psychology. So when you say the committee was reluctant to, that doesn't really predict what the committee will do next week, because the dynamics of committees are very complicated. Collectives contradict themselves very often. It happens that they choose what they don't want. I've been in faculty meetings for 20 years in 2 departments, so I have an ample collection of these things. But also there's a very sort of simple property that we all know about, which is that multiple interactions create emergent properties that people do not quite grasp as emergent properties. So, for example, if you say that St. Louis people are racist because there's the proof is that there's segregation, and it's true that in St. Louis, if you see a map of St. Louis, you'll see where black people live and where white people live, and there's a line that separates them. So you might think that this is much more racist than other cities. The example I had in mind was Louisville, where you don't find this thing, but much more mixture, and you might think, well, that the St. Louisans are particularly racist, much more than people in Kentucky. But that's not true, and people who study these things show that because of very simple dynamics of choice and choices given the environment that people give you because of their choices, you can have a very slight difference in preferences, in being with people who look like you, that creates a huge amount of segregation. That's a simple physical kind of model can tell you that. But also recursion and feedback are there, and they make the agent descriptions a bit circular. So this is the example of the Moroccan village where it's an interesting and funny situation in a way that in order to be a saint in the Moroccan villages that Ernest Gerner described, you have to be sort of plausibly linked to the prophet. You have to be a descendant of the prophet. But the problem is that there's way too much supply of potential saints because there are way too many people who descend from the prophet. So at some point there has to be a bit of weeding out. And the way it happens is that little by little people realize that a certain person does have grace more than others. One symptom, I'm simplifying the process a great deal here, but one process is that these people are particularly nice and generous. And because they're generous, it seems to be a symptom of grace. And because they have grace, you want to give them lots of little presents and be nice to them and help them and so on and so forth. So the people who become saints are the people who have been recognized as saints a little bit so that people gave them all the resources they can have to be generous. This is an economy, very poor economy, where you can't be generous unless people give you stuff. So sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to interrupt your point. Just before you move on to the next slide, are you assuming that individual people have a coherent belief, desire, psychology, or that individual people are
to a greater extent than collective? Yeah.
Sorry?
To a greater extent than collective. Yeah.
I mean, there are many counterexamples.
Sorry.
There are many counterexamples.
Yes, I know. No, I'm not. I'm not making any strong claims about that. I'm making a strong claim about the fact that the same psychology cannot be found in those collectives. So the circular process is that the person who is recognized as a saint because of symptoms, like generosity, is actually the person who's been put in that position by people's behaviors. So there is a sort of circularity to the process that no one sees. Because no one sees what the others are doing. This is a kind of social context where you don't know what the others are doing. And therefore, the fact that collectively we're sort of pushing someone towards their social position as a saint is invisible to most people. So let's take another example of these things where the sort of social folk sociology that we have seems to be defeated, or sort of in a way seems to have a kind of apparent self-evident quality that then turns out to be misleading. So power is described in many cultures as substance and force. So power is described as substance. This is the sort of example from Hawaii, just to show you that these things are very widespread in very different cultures. The Hawaiian kings, roles, etc., were possessors of efficacious something, and I translate it as something because the original term mana just means something that makes things work, basically. So they have something that's special, and is so special that they have to be apart from other people. They have to be separated from other people. They're taboo, they're called taboo. That means you cannot, touch them, you cannot approach them. Very low level, people can't even look at them because they have this. But another sort of very common theme in lots of tribal societies is that of the king as the person whose body is the embodiment of the kingdom. The body natural is the body politic, so that an alien king must be murdered, or at least must be ousted. This is in Ghana, where those kings, for example, cannot walk in public, because if they walked in public, they might stumble, and if they stumble, they have to be killed, because if they stumble, it means the kingdom is falling apart. These norms may be a bit stronger in the expression than in the actual exercise, but I don't know. So, power as a substance and force. Power as a force is the commonest metaphor we find in almost all human cultures. But these are examples of idioms, the expressions we have. The government forced people to do something. You have this notion of some push from a physical force. The opposition was crushed by the dictator, but some bits sort of stuck out and managed to overcome. And we shall overcome. We have all these spatial sort of metaphors. So we think of politics and power this way. But again, if you go to your social science 101 course, people will say, but that's not at all the way it works, because power is not located in agents at all. It's located in interactions, and based on agents' representations. The force description, once again, ignores the recursion in interactions. That is, for example, why does the policeman who tells you to stop your car and get out of the car have the power, so to speak, to get you out of the car? It's because that person, say that police officer herself, is constrained by the fact that she's employed by the police force, and that if she doesn't do it in a particular way, she will have problems with her superiors, who themselves are constrained by other constraints, etc. So there's a sort of amount of recursive constraints at which we just stop and think that this person has power. But also there's that big problem that force dynamics in power do not explain power change, and that's the big problem there. So you take the East German Politburo, the Communist Party in 1985, say, and you say, well, it's quite obvious that they have all the power, and that the people who hate them and would really dearly like to get rid of those that communist system do not have any power. And then you come back in '89 and it looks like the people have the power and the Communist Party has lost all the power. So it's very difficult. And in this situation, I'm not talking about the situation after they've left power. I'm talking about the situation during those demonstrations. Suddenly it looks like there's a very weak government and there's a very strong people in the streets. So how do they acquire power? It's very mysterious. There's no explanation that works in terms of force and force dynamics. And finally, a third theme that is very important to our folk sociology is that norms are external. And I have no very good sort of description of that, but it's something that is very clear in the way people talk about their norms. So I give you an example from the Fang ritual. This is where I did field work a long time ago. Well, people have, this guy is a diviner and he's putting together a ritual where he decides he has to understand, he's supposed to explain a certain situation, like why is a certain person sick. And instead of, so what he does is has this calabash, and it's under the calabash, the pot, there's a spider, a big spider that's been trapped, and a few little sticks. There are porcupine quills. And the way the spider will knock over some of those quills and not others will give you the answer to the question you're asking. So is it my grandmother who's bewitching me and making me sick? No, it's your paternal grandfather. That's the kind of things you have. But you have to use the right kind of calabash, the right kind of spider, the right kind of quills, etc. So as a dumb anthropologist, but it's good to be dumb if you're an anthropologist, you ask questions. Well, what if you do it another way? So why don't you take a mouse instead of a spider? Because those spiders are kind of nasty. So, why not take a mouse and put it there and you get the same result? Why not just have sticks instead of waiting to get a porcupine and which is not an easy task. So why not do it in another way? And the answer people give is, oh, you can do whatever you want if you like it, but it would not be the Ngam ritual. The Ngam ritual requires that you do this and this and this and that. And of course you could do it another way, but if you called it the Ngam ritual, you would be wrong, because the Ngam ritual is this and this and this and that. So there's a sense in which, it's not just what we agreed as a convention to call it that is the ritual. There is some script out there. And we may be wrong about what it is. Just to get from the almost sublime to the totally ridiculous, I've come across lots of examples in Europe of these things about cooking. So this is, for example, a picture of Italian agnolotti, which are tiny ravioli, but don't say they're tiny ravioli, because they're absolutely not tiny ravioli. And agnolotti are supposed to have no meat in them. And I was told this as a very, very clear rule of the agnolotti world by people in Asti, and I told them, but I know people in Milan who make it with meat in them. And the answer was, yes, they don't know agnolotti. They don't know what it is. And I said, no, but they call it agnolotti. Yes, they're wrong. So there is a sense in which the norm is beyond, what people, between the convention. But take a more serious example. Take those two statements by well-known political characters. I'm not a supporter of gay marriage. I believe that marriage is a sacred bond between a man and a woman. It's a very common way we have of expressing norms as facts. Like, a man is this and this and that. So when you say it's a true Scotsman kind of idea, a true Scotsman doesn't lie. And, of course, and in fact, when you say that, it's because you just had an example of a Scotsman who lied. So, but these people at the point where there was a debate, those of you who are students may not remember that there used to be a debate on that, and there used to be a perfectly respectable position, which is to say, well, no, gay people can have whatever they want, but not marriage. And then the argument would be because marriage is da-da-da-da-da. So, when I heard these things at the time, I thought, this is totally stupid. What kind of an argument is it to say that marriage has to be like this because marriage is like this? And then I thought, well, social science is not very, it's not a great idea in social science to say that people are stupid. It may be true, but it doesn't explain, that's the thing. So, okay, it's not a good theory. It feels good to think that as well. So people think that the norms spontaneously, they have a vague assumption or intuition that the norms are somehow external to people's opinions about the norms. So people will say, if you go again to Social Sciences 101, or that there are recursive aspects to norms, like, for example, you expect not just that other people will do that, but that other people will expect other people to do that. And that's what's the difference between norms and irregularities in behavior. So norms are not really like that. So the question is, if we have all these folk sociological sort of arguments, like groups are agent-like, so we can use our notions of goals and intentions like that for groups. Power is like a force, norms are external. Why is it that we have that, given that it doesn't seem to explain much to social processes? And I think the main reason is that we have intuitions, and those intuitions are particularly relevant to contexts of coordination. And those intuitions will make this folk sociology kind of salient to us and compelling and apparently self-evident. So we know that humans have very high coordination, that this is largely specific to humans, that that other species do not have as much coordination. There's a very good description in a book